The hall was not ready for silence. It had grown used to the endless hum of diplomacy, the routine applause, the carefully scripted words that filled the air and vanished like smoke. But on this day, as Ibrahim Traoré stood before the assembly, silence swallowed everything. Cameras zoomed in. Delegates shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. A young African leader, barely in his 30s, stood with the gravity of centuries in his eyes. He did not rush. He did not smile. His gaze carried the heaviness of famine, of colonial scars, of wars fought on African soil for resources never returned. And when he opened his mouth, his voice trembled, not from fear, but from the unbearable weight of truth that demanded to be spoken. "My people," he began, though the room knew he spoke not just for Burkina Faso, not just for Africa, but for every forgotten nation pushed to the margins. His words cracked through the ceremonial air. "We bury our children, while others profit from their graves. We watch as powers far from our lands ignite wars that consume us all. And still you ask us to be silent." The hall froze. No one expected this. Not here. Not in this place built for polished speeches and polite hypocrisy. His voice was raw, unpolished, human. It cut through the theater of politics like a blade through paper. Delegates leaned forward. Translators stumbled over the intensity. He lifted his head, eyes wet yet unyielding. Africa will not be silent. Humanity cannot survive on silence. If peace is denied to Iran, to Israel, to any people, then it is denied to all of us. A murmur rippled through the chamber. Some scoffed. Others stared in disbelief. But none could deny the force of the moment. This was not diplomacy. This was not performance. This was a young man's heart breaking in front of the world. And in that break lay a truth too powerful to ignore. The cameras caught every flicker of emotion, every pause heavy with unspoken history. It was not the grandeur of his position, but the naked sincerity of his pain that held the room hostage. And yet, as powerful as these opening words were, they were only the beginning, because what came after would shake the walls of power across continents. The silence he carved into the hall did not linger in a vacuum. It pressed against a world already trembling. Outside those walls, the planet was on fire with conflict. Missiles traced arcs across Middle Eastern skies. Iran and Israel teetered on the brink of catastrophe. Each new strike threatening to ignite a blaze that could consume the region. World powers watched, not as peacemakers, but as gamblers, their fortunes tied to war machines, their rhetoric polished but hollow. And far from those flashpoints, Africa stood scarred but unbroken. Nations bled from decades of exploitation, their resources siphoned, their dignity denied. Yet in the same breath, these nations carried the stubborn heartbeat of resilience. It was in this world, fractured, cynical, braced for more blood, that Ibrahim Traoré's words landed like thunder. Why did his voice matter? Because he spoke as one untainted by the machinery of war, unburdened by the pretense of power politics. He spoke as a man who had seen hunger in the eyes of his people, who had walked through villages where the only wealth was dignity, who had inherited the weight of promises broken by the very nations sitting before him. And now, standing on that stage, he dared to speak of peace at a time when peace was treated as a naive fantasy. The contrast was jarring. On one side, warmongers dressed in the language of diplomacy, their hands red though their suits remained spotless. On the other, a young African leader, unpolished, unafraid, speaking words soaked in both anguish and hope. His voice carried no army, no economic empire, no arsenal of missiles, only conviction. Yet in that hall, conviction rang louder than weapons. The cameras captured faces hardening, others softening. Some rolled their eyes, dismissing him as inexperienced, too young to understand the complexities of global affairs. But others could not look away, because in his trembling voice, they heard something rare, truth. The kind of truth that does not need statistics or policy briefings. The kind that pierces because it is lived, not theorized. And the timing was explosive, with tensions at a fever pitch. Every word that dared to challenge the inevitability of war felt dangerous. Every plea for peace felt radical. For too long, the global stage had been dominated by the same voices, the same architects of destruction who wrote the scripts of conflict like playwrights recycling an old tragedy. Traore shattered that pattern. His words mattered because they reintroduced something the world had nearly forgotten: moral courage. He was not calling for peace as a slogan, but as a survival instinct for Africa, for the Middle East, for the entire human story. His youth, his audacity, his refusal to play the game as written, these made his presence electrifying. The world had seen speeches before, a commentator would later say, but never like this, because this was not performance. It was not an appeal for applause. It was not about scoring diplomatic points. It was a reminder that behind every war statistic lay a child who would never wake again, a mother who would never stop mourning, a community torn apart. And as he paused, letting the weight of his words hang in the air, the tension in the room grew unbearable. What he had already said was bold enough to ripple across nations. But there was more, so much more. The young leader was only beginning to lift the veil. What came next would not just disturb the comfort of the powerful. It would expose them. It would force the world to reckon with truths long buried under the rubble of war. To understand the weight of Traoré's words, one must confront the shadow he spoke against. His antagonist was not a single leader, not a single nation. It was the system itself, a machinery of arrogance, perfected over centuries, where Western powers crowned themselves guardians of peace while feeding the very fires they claimed to extinguish. The system did not march with drums and flags, as empires once did. It dressed itself in the language of democracy, human rights, and stability. It filled halls with declarations about freedom and coexistence, even as bombs fell on cities thousands of miles away. It demanded obedience to international law, yet bent those same laws whenever its interests were threatened. The contradictions were staggering. Leaders shook hands before cameras, speaking of dialogue and unity, while behind closed doors they signed weapons contracts worth billions. They preached restraint to weaker nations but unleashed devastation when their own dominance was challenged. They condemned terrorism, yet funded proxy wars. They spoke of sovereignty, yet toppled governments. This duplicity was not subtle. It was a performance so shameless that it hollowed out the credibility of the very institutions meant to uphold justice. For Africa, the hypocrisy was a familiar wound. Colonizers had once marched into the continent under banners of civilization, draining its gold, diamonds, oil, and human labor in the name of progress. Today, the same script was rewritten in softer tones. Loans disguised as aid, partnerships laced with dependency, peacekeeping forces that guarded resources more fiercely than lives. The faces changed, the slogans evolved, but the structure remained. Power concentrated in a few hands, suffering scattered across many. And in the Middle East, the hypocrisy blazed with equal cruelty. Nations demanded peace in Israel and Iran, yet they armed both sides, ensuring that conflict never truly ceased. Each missile that soared into the night sky carried the fingerprint of factories thousands of miles away. Each truce was fragile because war was profitable. The longer the fires burned, the more the system thrived. Ordinary people saw through it. They saw their streets filled with hunger, while global leaders spoke of prosperity. They saw schools crumble while billions were poured into weapon stockpiles. They saw elections disrupted, currencies manipulated, resources stripped bare. Trust in global institutions eroded not because of conspiracy, but because of lived reality. How could one believe in the purity of the United Nations when its chambers echoed with speeches of peace delivered by those who ordered wars? How could one trust the International Monetary Fund when its loans left nations poorer, their sovereignty reduced to signatures on contracts written in foreign capitals? The outrage was not theoretical. It lived in the protests on dusty streets, in the chants of students demanding dignity, in the whispers of farmers watching their lands dry while multinationals drained rivers. It was a kind of outrage that cut across continents. Iranians tired of sanctions that starved them, Israelis exhausted by endless fear, Africans suffocating under economic chains disguised as cooperation. And still, the system persisted. Arrogance became its fuel. It believed no one could challenge its dominance, that speeches of resistance were mere noise. It underestimated the hunger of the oppressed for truth, for dignity, for leaders who would not bow. This arrogance birthed a theater of cruelty. Endless summits that produced nothing but press releases peace talks that served as intermissions before the next war, humanitarian aid that arrived after lives had already been lost. Traoré's voice rose against this theater. By simply speaking, he forced the world to confront what it had grown skilled at ignoring. His youth clashed with their tradition. His honesty clashed with their hypocrisy. His trembling sincerity clashed with their calculated detachment. He was a living contradiction to their contradictions. The system he confronted was not abstract. It was present in that very hall. It wore tailored suits and polite smiles. It held the microphones, controlled the cameras, dictated the narratives. But in that moment, as he spoke with the urgency of one who had buried too many of his people, the arrogance cracked. For a fleeting second, the theater faltered. And yet, the system would not collapse easily. Its power was too entrenched, its reach too global, its appetite too insatiable. That was the tension pulsing beneath the silence. Could the raw humanity of one leader disrupt centuries of calculated dominance? Could a plea for peace pierce through a structure addicted to war? The audience watching from around the world did not yet know the answer, but outrage was building, resentment boiling. The young man had spoken truths that resonated in millions of hearts, truths long buried under propaganda and polished lies. And as he prepared to reveal the personal fire that fueled his defiance, the system he challenged braced itself. For the story was about his shift, not to its contradictions, but to the life that gave those contradictions their fiercest opponent. Before he was a symbol, before he stood in that hall with the world watching, Ibrahim Traoré was a boy running through the dusty streets of Burkina Faso, barefoot, unguarded, unpolished. He was not born into privilege or power. His childhood was marked by scarcity. The kind of scarcity that forces a child to grow older than his years, to recognize injustice not as an abstract idea, but as the air he breathed. In those early years, he watched his mother measure grain carefully, so the family could eat for another day. He saw his neighbors rise before dawn to tend fields that yielded little, while the wealth of their soil was siphoned by contracts signed in distant capitals. He learned that dignity was not handed down. It was wrestled from those who would prefer to keep it hidden. And in this crucible of hardship, a seed of defiance took root. Education became his first weapon. He devoured books, not to escape reality, but to understand it. He studied history and realized that the chains on his people were not accidents but legacies. He studied politics and discovered how systems were designed to keep Africa fractured and dependent. Each page sharpened him, and each discovery hardened his resolve. But he was not content to simply learn. He wanted to act. The military became his path, not for glory, but for service. To wear the uniform was to stand at the line between exploitation and resistance. Traoré rose quickly, not because of connections, but because of competence and conviction. Soldiers respected him because he did not command from a distance. He walked with them, ate with them, shared their struggles. His youth could have been a weakness in a hierarchy that prized age and tradition, but he turned it into strength. He embodied a new generation unwilling to wait another 50 years for change. But service brought sacrifice. His choice to defy the old order came at a personal cost. Friends turned against him. Mentors warned him to stay quiet, to play the game, to accept the slow drip of reform. He refused. He watched leaders older than him sell their nations for scraps of influence, bowing to colonial legacies disguised as partnerships. He swore he would not join them. The turning point came not in a single dramatic moment, but in countless small ones. A farmer losing land to foreign investors, a village going without clean water while contracts for mineral wealth were signed abroad, a mother begging for medicine that never arrived because funds had been siphoned elsewhere. Each injustice stacked upon the last, until silence was no longer an option. His rise to leadership was not polished. It was raw, almost accidental, the product of a people's desperation for someone untainted. He did not seek the stage sought him, because he represented what others could not. When he stepped into power, it was with the fire of a man who had not forgotten where he came from. He refused luxury when his people lived without. He refused foreign dictates when his nation's dignity was at stake. And that refusal defined him. Colonial legacies had left deep scars, but he would not allow them to define Burkina Faso's future. He spoke openly of sovereignty, of self-determination, of Africa's right to chart its own course. He was not blind to the risks. He knew defiance painted a target on his back, yet he wore the risk as a badge. For him, the greater risk was to live as a puppet, dangling from strings pulled in Paris, Washington, or Brussels. What made Traoré remarkable was not just his defiance, but his authenticity. He was not a manufactured politician, rehearsing lines crafted by advisors. He was not a performer seeking applause. He was a soldier, a son of the soil, a man shaped by hunger, by sacrifice, by the raw textures of a life lived close to the ground. His words resonated because they were not written for him. They were carved into him by struggle. And so, when he finally stood on that world stage, the weight of his journey pressed into every syllable. Delegates saw a young leader in a suit. But behind that suit was a barefoot boy who once raced through the dust, the soldier who once knelt beside his comrades, the son who once promised his mother that he would not be silent. Behind that suit was a lifetime of battles against poverty, against dependency, against the arrogance of powers that had dismissed Africa for generations. It was this lifetime that gave his voice its force. His speech was not an interruption of global politics. It was a culmination of years of quiet resistance, of sacrifices unseen by the cameras. And as he looked out into the sea of faces, his presence was not just his own. It carried the invisible weight of millions who could not stand there with him. These struggles shaped the words he was about to deliver. Words born not in think tanks or strategy rooms, but in fields where farmers bent their backs under the sun, in classrooms where children wrote by candlelight, in homes where dignity meant surviving one more day. Words unlike any the world had ever heard. And as he drew a breath to continue, the room leaned closer. What came next would turn his backstory into something more than biography. It would transform his life's pain into a weapon of truth sharp enough to pierce the armor of arrogance surrounding him. The moment Traoré stepped onto the platform, the dismissals began. They did not come in open jeers. Such arrogance was too well trained for that. But in the subtle theater of diplomacy, whispers rustled across the rows of delegates. A smirk curled on the lips of an ambassador who thought experience mattered more than conviction. A veteran politician leaned to his neighbor, muttering that Africa's young revolutionary would soon learn how the world really worked. To them, this was a boy among kings, a soldier out his depth, a leader too unseasoned to play on their stage. But their whispers collided with the silence he commanded. As Traoré spoke, the tremor of his voice did not reveal weakness. It revealed urgency. He did not hide behind formal platitudes. He aimed straight at the hypocrisy that filled the chamber. "You speak of peace," he said, eyes fixed on rows of officials whose signatures had fueled conflicts. "Yet your hands profit from war. You condemn violence, yet your weapons circle the globe. How many speeches will you give before a single child's grave is spared?" The words landed like blows. Some faces hardened, others shifted uncomfortably, but none could pretend not to hear. His sentences were sharp, unadorned, stripped of the careful phrasing diplomats used to blur meaning. He spoke as a soldier who had seen comrades bleed, as a son who had seen his people starve. There was no veil between truth and delivery. The tension climbed. The whispers ceased. Even the smirks faltered, replaced by stony silence. He dared to name what others avoided. He spoke of Africa's stolen resources, of Middle Eastern wars inflamed by outsiders, of global institutions that preached equality while practicing exploitation. His voice carried the accusation, not of one man, but of generations silenced before him. Delegates exchanged glances. Some eyes narrowed with contempt. Others widened with recognition. The room was divided, not between nations, but between those who built the system and those who had suffered under it. Traoré had forced the line into the open. "Do not tell us to wait," he declared, his voice rising with conviction. "We have waited while you robbed our lands. We have waited while you waged your wars. We have waited while you called yourselves peacemakers, even as you set the world on fire. No more waiting. No more silence." A hush swept the hall, thicker than any applause could have been. It was a silence of confrontation, the silence that comes when truth pierces through the noise. His youth, once dismissed, now seemed like prophecy. He was not weighed down by decades of compromise, not dulled by endless negotiation. He was sharp, unyielding, unafraid to say what those older than him had buried beneath diplomacy. And still, he was only building. The cadence of his voice shifted, each pause heavier than the last, each sentence dragging the hall deeper into discomfort. Cameras lingered on faces frozen in uneasy stillness. Commentators watching from afar scrambled to capture the moment, but words on screens could not convey the electricity in the room. He had taken the whispers and turned them into silence, the smirks into stares. He had stripped the arrogance of its mask. Every word tightened the tension. Every phrase drew the hall closer to a breaking point. The question hung unspoken. How far would he go? And then, just when the silence grew unbearable, came the words that no one was ready to hear. The silence pressed on the hall like a weight. Every eye fixed on the young leader, who stood alone at the podium. Ibrahim Traoré took in a breath, his chest rising slowly, his gaze sweeping across the chamber where the most powerful figures on earth sat in expectation or in dread. For a moment, the microphone hummed with nothing but stillness. And then, his voice broke that silence with words no one expected. "I stand before you," he began, his tone low and resonant. "Not only as a soldier of Africa, not only as a leader of Burkina Faso, but as a son of humanity." His voice trembled slightly, not with fear, but with the weight of memory. "And as a son, I cannot remain silent while the family of humanity tears itself apart." Delegates leaned forward. Cameras zoomed in. Something in his tone signaled that what was coming would not be another predictable statement. "You debate Iran and Israel as if they are pawns on a chessboard," he continued, his eyes narrowing. "As if their suffering is strategy, as if their people are obstacles to your ambitions. But in Gaza, in Tel Aviv, in Tehran, in Jerusalem, there are mothers bearing their children. There are fathers staring at empty chairs. There are children asking questions that no leader in this room has dared to answer. Why must we die for your politics? Why must we bleed for your arrogance?" The hall froze. Some delegates looked away. Others clutched their earpieces as translations carried the words into every corner of the globe. Traoré's voice thickened with emotion, each syllable heavy with grief. "I am African," he said, pausing as his eyes glistened. "And we know what it is to be treated as less than human. We know what it is when our dead are counted as numbers, when our pain is background noise to the powerful. We know, and I tell you this, we will not let the world accept such cruelty again. Not in Africa, not in the Middle East, not anywhere." The chamber stirred. A few nervous coughs broke the silence, but they were drowned by the thunder of his words. He leaned closer to the microphone, his voice sharpening like steel. "Do not preach peace while your factories of war run day and night. Do not speak of humanity while your banks profit from blood. Do not tell us that war is destiny, because war is a choice. And peace is also a choice." The air shifted. Faces hardened, some with anger, some with shame. The arrogance of seasoned politicians, the practiced smirks, the bored expressions began to falter. A camera caught one leader shifting uncomfortably, his jaw tightening as if caught in the act of hypocrisy. Another's eyes darted down to his notes, unable to meet Traoré's gaze. "Look at us," Traoré said, his voice suddenly softer, almost a whisper. "The so-called leaders of the world. We sit in marble halls. We drink fine water. We speak of humanity, while bombs fall on children who have never known peace." He paused, and in that pause the hall felt the sharp edge of truth cutting into its conscience. And then his voice cracked, heavy with unshed tears. "How many more tiny coffins must we see before you will understand? How many graves? How many burned cities?" The chamber was dead still. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras panned across rows of uneasy leaders, their faces betraying the cracks Traoré had forced open. The arrogance was unraveling, one syllable at a time. "Africa," he declared, his voice rising again, "will not be silent. We who have endured centuries of exploitation, we who have buried millions in wars not of our making. We say enough. Enough." His fist struck the podium, the sound echoing like a gavel that declared judgment on the powerful. And then came the words that pierced the world. "If Iran and Israel cannot see each other's humanity, then let Africa remind them. If you, the so-called guardians of order, cannot call for peace, then Africa will. I say to Israel, your children deserve to grow without fear. I say to Iran, your children deserve to dream without war. And I say to the world, do not dare rob them of that future. Gasps rippled through the chamber. It was audacity, pure and unfiltered, a young African leader daring to speak directly into the heart of one of the most dangerous conflicts on earth. No careful neutrality, no diplomatic hedging, just truth, spoken with the moral authority of suffering and survival. His voice is softened again, trembling. I speak as one who has carried the dead of my people. I speak as one who has seen war. And I tell you, there is no victory in ashes. There is no triumph in graves. There is only sorrow, multiplied and multiplied again, until it consumes us all. Delegates shifted in their seats. Some bowed their heads. The cameras captured faces tight with discomfort, jaws clenched, eyes that could not mask the truth pressing down on them. Traore had shattered the facade. And yet, he said, his tone suddenly bright with fragile hope, we can choose differently. We can choose life. We can choose dignity. We can choose to stop counting corpses and start counting the days of peace we will gift our children. Will you choose it? Or will you let history curse you as the ones who had the chance to end war and refused? The silence was unbearable now. No one dared move. His words hung in the air like a verdict. And then, just when the weight became too heavy, he leaned forward and delivered the final strike. We, Africa, once colonized, once enslaved, once exploited, we stand now not as beggars, but as witnesses. Witnesses to your hypocrisy. Witnesses to your arrogance. And we tell you this, history is watching, and history will not forgive. The room erupted, not in noise at first, but in stunned stillness. Delegates blinked, as if they could not believe what they had just heard. And then, slowly, a ripple of applause began. It grew row by row, until it swelled into a roar that shook the chamber walls. Cameras caught faces, some clapping reluctantly, others with genuine fervor. The crowd outside, watching on screens, cheered and wept. In that moment, history tilted. A young African soldier, a leader dismissed as inexperienced, had stood before the world and forced it to look in the mirror. He had broken the arrogance of the powerful, pierced through the veil of politics, and reminded humanity of its soul. And yet, even as the applause thundered, even as the chamber rose to its feet, one truth lingered in the silence between claps. These words were only the beginning. The storm they unleashed had only just begun. The applause had barely faded when the first headlines began to appear. News outlets, scrambling to outpace each other, plastered their screens with bold letters. The young African leader who spoke for peace. Clips of Traoré's trembling voice, his fist on the podium, and his unflinching call to Iran and Israel played on loop across global networks. Anchors who had expected a routine session were suddenly breathless, calling the moment historic, unprecedented, even a rebuke that no one saw coming. Social media moved faster than satellites. Within minutes, hashtags erupted. Hashtag Voice of Africa. Hashtag Peace for Iran and Israel. Hashtag Traore Truth. A short clip of his line, "There is no victory in ashes," went viral, subtitled in Arabic, Hebrew, French, English, and countless other languages. Memes flooded timelines. One showed Traoré standing with a dove perched on his shoulder, while the world leaders behind him looked like stone statues. Another contrasted his young face with the weary expressions of older politicians, captioned, "The future versus the past." In Tehran, young Iranians shared the clip with messages like, "He spoke what our leaders never dare." In Tel Aviv, Israelis posted side-by-side images of their own children watching Traoré on television, with captions reading, "May his words reach our leaders before it's too late." Across the Middle East, his name trended, not as a distant African figure, but as a brother who had voiced their grief and their hope. In Africa, the effect was seismic. Youth in Ouagadougou, Lagos, Nairobi, Dakar poured into the streets, not in protest this time, but in celebration. They danced with flags, painted his quotes on walls, and sang songs that mixed old revolutionary rhythms with his words. For once, Africa was not trending because of a coup, a famine, or a tragedy. Africa was trending because one of its sons had shaken the world awake. Journalists marveled at the unlikely messenger. Pundits admitted, sometimes grudgingly, that while seasoned leaders drowned speeches in jargon, Traore had cut through with unvarnished humanity. Even his critics, those who dismiss him as too young or too radical, struggled to explain away the raw global resonance of his words. One columnist wrote, "You may disagree with his politics, but you cannot deny the truth in his tears." Celebrities joined the chorus. Musicians sampled his speech into tracks that spread on TikTok. Activists across continents quoted him in rallies. Even clergy of different faiths invoked his words in sermons, reminding congregations that peace was not only divine but necessary. The imagery of an African soldier in uniform calling for dignity between Jews and Muslims, Persians and Arabs, Africans and Europeans. It was too powerful to ignore, and the ripple effect was not confined to elites. In refugee camps, displaced families replayed his words on battered smartphones, finding a rare flicker of validation. In classrooms, teachers used clips of his speech to spark discussions on justice and solidarity. On factory floors and in marketplaces, ordinary people debated his message as if it were their own. For once, the fractures of politics seemed momentarily bridged by the sincerity of a single voice. But with a wave of adoration came inevitable backlash. Some Western officials muttered that Traore had overstepped, that he had played to the gallery. Anonymous sources warned that such audacity would complicate partnerships. Yet even their dismissals rang hollow against a tidal wave of public sentiment. The arrogance of power looked small, defensive, even afraid, next to the young leader who had spoken without fear. In the Middle East, leaders found themselves cornered by the echo of his words. Citizens wrote open letters. "If Traore can speak for peace, why can't you?" Protesters painted murals of his face in alleys of Beirut and Cairo. In Israel, a grassroots movement used his speech to launch petitions. In Iran, students recited his lines during campus vigils. For a fleeting moment, his call united voices across divides that had seemed eternal. And in Africa, a quiet revolution stirred. The youth saw in him a mirror, someone young, unpolished, uncompromising, proof that they too could speak truth to power. His speech became more than a political moment. It became a cultural spark. Musicians, poets, painters, and filmmakers began weaving his words into art, capturing the spirit of dignity he had resurrected. As night fell across continents, millions replayed the scene. Traore's eyes shining, his voice trembling yet unbreakable, his words echoing against the marble walls of power. In every replay, audiences felt the same chill. This was not politics as usual. This was history cracking open. And yet, even as the world embraced the message, one question lingered like smoke after fire. Would the powerful listen? Or had Traore's words, however immortal, only marked the beginning of a greater struggle? Because the applause had ended. The headlines were still glowing. But behind closed doors, decisions were being made. Decisions that would test whether the dignity he demanded could survive the machinery of war. And so the world held its breath once more, waiting to see if the spark he lit would become a flame or be smothered by those who feared its fire. When the noise of applause and a flood of headlines began to settle, what remained was not merely a speech. It was a set of truths so simple, so human, that they could not be drowned out. Ibrahim Traoré had not only addressed leaders, he had reframed the very compass of global politics. Peace, he had declared, is greater than endless war. That line, replayed on every channel, was more than a plea. It was a verdict. For decades, war had been normalized, justified, repackaged as strategy. But Traoré had stripped away the illusions and forced the world to face the obvious. War is not strength, it is failure. And peace, so often dismissed as weakness, stood revealed as the greatest act of courage. He had gone further. Dignity is greater than arrogance. In those words, millions heard their own silent prayers answered. The arrogance of nations that exploited, of leaders who postured, of powers that dictated. None of it could stand against the raw dignity of a young African leader who spoke with honesty, humility, and love for humanity. For once, the hierarchy was reversed. The powerful looked small, and the so-called powerless stood tall. And then his deepest blow. Humanity is greater than exploitation. It was a line that silenced critics, the line that outlived the chamber walls. It spoke to every colonized people, every worker underpaid, every family displaced by war, every child denied their future. It reminded the world that systems built on greed and domination could never be stronger than the simple bond that makes us human. These truths, woven together, formed the heart of his message, and they became more than words. They became a kind of anthem across continents. Protesters painted them on banners. Teachers quoted them in classrooms. Parents repeated them to their children, explaining that dignity and humanity were not luxuries, but birthrights. For the first time in years, people felt that politics had broken free of jargon and lies. They felt seen, they felt spoken for, and they felt reminded that change was not only possible, but inevitable. Traoré's speech was not perfect. It was not polished. It did not offer 10-point plans or diplomatic formulas. It was raw, imperfect, and deeply human, and that was why it endured. Because in his broken voice, in his trembling pauses, people recognized themselves, their fears, their hopes, their longing for a world that had not yet been born. As days turned into weeks, his words continued to ripple outward. Commentators began to say that the speech had become more than a moment. It had become a moral compass, a reminder that in the theater of politics, there are still truths that cut deeper than power plays, truths that belong to every human being, regardless of nation or faith. And perhaps most powerfully, Traoré's message gave permission for ordinary people to demand extraordinary change. It told the world that leaders are not gods, that institutions are not untouchable, that silence is not inevitable. It told every child watching that dignity does not require wealth, that peace does not require permission, and that humanity does not require compromise. In the end, the lesson was not about Africa or the Middle East alone. It was about all of us, about whether we will choose to keep building a world of walls, graves, and arrogance, or whether we will choose something greater. As Traoré left the podium that day, the words he had spoken no longer belonged to him. They belonged to humanity. They belonged to the mother in Gaza, the father in Tel Aviv, the child in Ouagadougou, the student in Tehran. They belonged to anyone who had ever hoped for a world less cruel, less divided, less consumed by greed. And so, long after the applause faded, long after the headlines shifted, one truth remained like a flame that refused to be extinguished. Dignity, peace, and humanity will always outlive arrogance, war, and exploitation. The world had been shaken, but it had also been offered a choice that would define generations. And the question hung in the air, bright and unstoppable. Will we have the courage to choose it? His heartbreaking words had done more than echo through marble walls. They had shaken the very conscience of the world. A young African soldier, a leader dismissed as too raw, too unpolished, had stood at the podium and spoken truths that history itself could not ignore. Peace over endless war, dignity over arrogance, humanity over exploitation. These were not just slogans. They were the foundations of a future waiting to be claimed. And as his voice cracked with emotion, as his plea for Iran and Israel's children pierced the silence, the world realized it was witnessing something rare, a moment when dignity silenced arrogance. That is why his speech lives beyond that day. It belongs to all who dare to imagine a better world, to all who refuse to let war and greed define humanity's destiny. And now, it belongs to you, the listener, the witness, the one holding the story in your heart. So I invite you, subscribe to witness more stories where truth triumphs over lies, where courage dismantles corruption, where dignity silences arrogance. Share this story, because the world deserves peace, and peace begins when voices like Traoré's are amplified, not buried. Imagine what happens when millions hear his words. Imagine what happens when his cry for peace becomes a movement no power can suppress. That is not fantasy. That is a revolution of dignity, already stirring across continents. And so we close where it began, with silence. The hall froze. The cameras zoomed in. The world held its breath. And then a whisper, carried like a warning and a promise. The next speech may ignite a revolution,